The year 2025 is already well underway, and the world seems more economically fragile than ever. Many are wondering which countries are at risk of sinking into bankruptcy this year. Get ready to discover nations that you probably never imagined would be left with no money at all. The reasons for this impending bankruptcy are often surprising, and for some, excessive dependence on the United States or astronomical debt are the main causes. Let me take you on a tour of the countries that might see their economies collapse this year and what has brought them to such a critical situation. 1. Sri Lanka. The perfect storm behind the idyllic image of its golden beaches and lush landscapes, Sri Lanka finds itself on the brink of financial ruin. For several years, the nation has tried to accelerate its development by borrowing massively to modernize its infrastructure, particularly its ports and airports, hoping that the tourism industry and the export of products like tea and spices would balance the finances. However, the global health crisis hit hard, reducing tourism flows to nothing and trapping the country in a debt trap it could not honor. On top of this crisis came the rising prices of food and fuel and rampant inflation, plunging much of the population into unbearable poverty. The minimum wage is now insufficient to cover basic needs, and millions of Sri Lankans live in total uncertainty. Economists agree that if this debt and uncertainty spiral doesn't stop, Sri Lanka could very well be one of the first countries to go bankrupt in 2025. 2. Bangladesh. Fragile growth. In Bangladesh, the economic situation is at a turning point. The country has experienced explosive growth thanks to its textile industry. But this same dependence has now become a burden. With orders moving to countries offering even lower production costs, tensions in factories, and political instability, the situation is now more fragile than ever. The devaluation of the local currency and difficulties in generating foreign currency have left the country in crisis. Workers supporting the garment industry are seeing their living conditions deteriorate, and the population suffers from inflation and rising unemployment. Without a radical change in the management of its economy and necessary diversification, Bangladesh could find itself at a crossroads between recession and bankruptcy. 3. North Korea. Between propaganda and shortage. North Korea continues to maintain a facade of military power and national grandeur, but this image is slowly cracking. The economy is severely affected by excessive dependence on China and international sanctions that increasingly isolate the country. The food situation, already fragile, has worsened with poor crop management and increasingly unpredictable weather. The country also suffers from high debt and an extremely low standard of living, while sanctions continue to stifle any possibility of recovery. With censored information and constant propaganda, the population remains in ignorance. But international experts estimate that North Korea could very well be on the verge of an economic collapse. 4. Venezuela. The search for an unlikely recovery. Once an oil powerhouse, Venezuela has sunk into hyperinflation, with rates so high that the population now weighs bills instead of counting them. Oil, which should have been the key to prosperity, is now a burden, with production in freefall due to years of mismanagement and corruption. Even with the recent rise in oil prices, the situation is not improving. The lack of investment and the massive exodus of talent are obstacles to economic recovery. The country is stuck in a vicious cycle of debt, inefficiency, and social crisis. If things don't change quickly, bankruptcy is inevitable, threatening to destroy the hope of millions of Venezuelans. 5. Zimbabwe, a legacy of hyperinflation. Zimbabwe, once known as the breadbasket of Africa, is another example of dramatic economic decline. After a series of poorly managed agricultural reforms and excessive money printing, the economy collapsed. The country still suffers from the devastating effects of hyperinflation, with such high denominations of banknotes that they have become symbols of this debacle. Despite some attempts to stabilize the economy, the situation remains critical. Confidence in the local currency is almost non-existent. Industry is in ruins, and foreign investors remain wary. The population lives in poverty, and the country seems trapped in a debt spiral it cannot control. The bankruptcy of Zimbabwe is more than a possibility. It seems to be a matter of time. 6. Greece, the return of the shadow of debt. Greece is an example of resilience, but also of a persistent financial burden. After being hit by the debt crisis in 2008, the country had to rely on bailout plans that imposed severe austerity measures. These measures have left deep scars on the economy and the daily lives of citizens. The minimum wage remains insufficient to cover basic needs, and public debt is still astronomical. Social tensions and high unemployment, especially among young people, fuel an unstable climate. If a new global recession hits, Greece could very well find itself once again on the brink of disaster. The threat of a new financial crisis that would push the country back into insolvency is very real. Conclusion: a world in instability. As we explore these examples of nations on the brink of bankruptcy, it becomes clear that global financial instability is a phenomenon affecting an increasing number of countries. Between poor management, crushing debts, and internal crises, many countries are at risk of collapsing if radical solutions are not implemented. Whether you are concerned about the geopolitical implications of these potential bankruptcies or simply curious to see how these countries navigate this economic storm, one thing is certain: 2025 could very well mark the beginning of the end for several nations, and the consequences for their populations could be dramatic.